In week 8, we are introduced to a data structure called an array. So you will see in Module 19 and 20 this mention of the array as well as the array list. I'm going to focus in this video on what an array is. So as you go through Module 19, you'll see some documentation introducing you to what an array is. So I'm going to jump to what I find to be a way I think of arrays. None of these are really ideal. I guess this one's probably the best one. So I like to think of an array as a collection. So if you can imagine this box right here, this box is kind of a box with subcompartments in it. So let's say that I have this collection of integers. So here's the integer 7, 14, 1, negative 60. So these are 4 integers that kind of live in the same house. This big long box, they all have their own, they all live in the same house. And each have their own room. Like 7 has its own little compartment room, 14 does, 1, negative 60. Each one of these integers, they all live in the same house, and the house is called counts. That's the name of the house. It's called counts. And 7 lives in room 0, and 14 lives in room 1, and 1 lives in 2, and negative 60 lives in 3. So regardless, these are all integers that live in the house called counts, and 7 is in room 0, or index 0, and 14 is in 1, which is index 1. And the number integer 1 is in index 2, and negative 60 is in index 3. So these numbers here at the bottom are referred to as an index, or plural would be indices. So the index itself is basically, it's a reference point to where this integer is. So if you could imagine that you could take this box and you could separate it out of the house. It is an integer. This box, box 1, it's an integer. So each one of these is really just an integer. It's just that they all kind of in the same collection now. So if we're in JGrasp, let's say I'm just demonstrating, this is a practice file. So let's say I wanted to create an int called num0, and I'm going to assign it to some arbitrary value. I'm going to have another integer, and I'm going to call it num1. Again, these are just totally, there's no rhyme or reason to the values of the numbers. So I could continue to create more and more numbers. Each one of these is an integer. So like for example, this is integer num0, this is int num1, int num2, they each are an integer. And if I want to display these, of course, I can just do system.out.println, and I could display the values of these integers. So far, this is really nothing that we haven't already seen. You guys already know this. And I can go ahead and display this, and I can see that I get the values 594, because that's what I have. I'm going to clear that out. So I get 594. Well, these are each integers. That's an integer, that's an integer, that's an integer. So they're all the same data type. Is there a way to kind of put them in a collection where they each have their own individuality, it's just that now they're in a collection because they're all integers? Can we store them in some other collective way? And that's what an array allows us to do. So the syntax for that, I can go ahead and I can do that. I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to do the exact same thing as this, but I'm going to put it in an array. So I'm going to create an array that does the same thing. So I'm going to create an integer array, and that's what these square brackets does. And I'm going to call this collection of integers, I'm going to call it nums. And I'm going to say that I want in this collection, I want to have the integers 5, 9, and 4. So this curly bracket syntax, this is called an initializer list. If I'm creating an array, and square brackets is an indicator that you're dealing with an array, if I'm creating an array and I know what the numbers are when I create it, it doesn't always have to be integers, by the way. It can be strings or doubles or booleans or any data type. Even objects can go in arrays. Even arrays can go in arrays. So in this case, I'm creating an array of integers. But if I know the integers that are going to go in this array when I create it, then I can initialize it right away to these values. And in that case, I can use the syntax with curly brackets. So the output for this could be pretty much the same. I want to display the values, but now it's not called num0. It's nums in index 0. It's nums at index 1 and nums at index 2. So why do we start at 0? The very first value in an array is always index 0. Index meaning it's kind of like a box. This is the box numbering system. It starts at 0, just the way the rules are. So now this will give me the exact same output. I don't see anything different because it's each one of these guys, this is an integer. That's an integer. So is that. It's just that each one of them, they each are their individual values, just like these were. It's the exact same thing, except now they all live in the same house. That's really all that is. Was there another way I can create these integers? What if I know I want 3 integers, but when I create it, I don't know what the values are going to be? Maybe I want the user to give me those values. So I can say, all right, that's fine. I want to declare memory space for this, but I know that I want this to be new memory space for an integer collection with 3 values. So this is another way to create an array, except what's happening here at line 15 is it says, give me an integer array called nums, and this integer array called nums is going to set aside new memory space for 3 integers. That's all this does. I mean, right now, if I go to run this, what's going to be shown in each box is 0, 0, 0. Because by default, it's just going to say, well, we don't know what these values are. We're just going to assign 0 to it. Now I can assign those values. I could say nums index 0 will now be assigned the value of 5. And then nums index 1 will be assigned, I can't remember what I had for it. Was it 4? And nums 2 will be 9. And now when I go to run this, I will see those same values again because I've assigned them. I've assigned the first index 0 is the first index, 5, and the second index 1 is 4, and the third index is index 9. By the way, notice that I have 3 integers in this array. I have 3 indices. The size of this array is 3. The range of index numbers is 0 to 1 less than the size. 2 is 1 less than the size. So this example here, how many indices or how many indexes are there? Well, there's 4. The range of the index numbers starts at 0 and goes to 1 less than the size of the array. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Well, now that I can create an array of any size, now I can use this. I'm going to get rid of this code. Now I can use this to get input from a user, and I can have the user tell me what these values are. So now what I could do is I could go ahead and import scanner, our friend scanner, and I can say that I want to have a scanner object. I'll call this KB. And instead of hard coding these values, now I'm going to let the user tell me. I'm going to say, well, there's 3 integers, and I want the user to give me those values. I can say something like hey, give me, enter the value, sorry about my dog barking, enter first integer. Now I know I'm going to have 3, so I'm going to go ahead and say, give me the first integer, and I'm going to assign nums 0 what the scanner gives me for the next int, and I'm going to continue to do that 2 more times. This will be for the second integer and the third. I'm going to assign index 1, the next value, and 2. So now what this should do is something similar, except now the user is going to be allowed to tell me. It says enter first integer. I'm going to do something totally crazy and do 98. Then second integer 75, and then 50. So I get 98, 75, and 50. So now the user is giving me those values. You'll notice that I'm pretty much doing the same thing over and over again, doing it 3 times. Well, gee, anytime in programming you see yourself doing the same thing over and over again, that is a great opportunity for a loop. So I know how many times I'm going to go through this. I'm going to go through it 3 times. So I can use a for loop, can I not? I can say for int I. I'm going to use I because it stands for index. It doesn't really have to be I. And I'm going to do this for as long as I is less than 3 because that's the size of my array. And what am I going to do in here? I'm going to continue to ask the user for an integer. I can say just enter integer rather than saying enter first, second, or third. But notice that right now what this is going to do is they're always going to be putting an integer in which index. Well, gee, they're going to be putting the integer in index 0. I don't want it to always be 0 because now, I mean, this will run 3 times, but what it's going to do is if I enter 98 and then I do 75 and 50, notice that I only see 50 because I keep overwriting index 0. Don't really want to do that. I want to start with 0 and then go to 1 and then go to 2. Well, I need some kind of placeholder that starts at 0, then goes to 1, then goes to 2. Oh, didn't think about that. I does that. So I can say nums of whatever index I is, or nums sub I, is going to be the next integer. So now I can do the same thing. It just says enter integer, and I can do my 98, 75, and 50, and I'm right back where I was. That's great. Well, notice my output is kind of doing the same thing. I'm doing the same thing over and over again. So can I use a for loop for output? Sure can. Why not? Because that for loop is just going to go through, but instead of getting a value, I can display a value. I don't need this anymore. So I can just display the value of nums whatever I is, and I don't need these 3 lines of output. Because that pretty much is the same thing. So here I'm getting user values and storing them in the array, and then here I am just simply displaying user values from inside the array. So this will again do the same thing. I'm just kind of cleaning up and making my code more efficient. Still works. So this is a little bit about how arrays work. We can start to use them to kind of organize our code and make it a little bit better. Now keep in mind, again, this is a very simple example. Here I'm creating an integer array of 3 ints. Again, you can have an array of any kind of data structure. It can be double, string, Boolean, and yes, you can even have an array of objects. You can even have an array of arrays. So it gets a little bit complex. This is just the beginning here, but just to kind of introduce you to how arrays work.